Welcome to the Midstream News Podcast. I'm Kevin Broom, and I'm here today with GPA Midstream Chair Greg Floerke. Greg is also the Chief Operating Officer of MPLX. Greg, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being our first guest.
Thanks, Kevin. Glad to be here.
The idea of this podcast is to give an opportunity for people to hear more about GPA Midstream, learn more about the midstream, and have more insight into what's going on at GPA Midstream and GPSA to benefit the midstream industry, which, as I think we both agree, is vital to America's energy system, the world's energy, and to the economy. So let's just dive right in. What brought you into the midstream industry? How did you get started?
Well, it's an interesting story. I grew up in the plains, eastern Colorado, actually, and I grew up on a farm and ranch, and there was gas drilling going on around the area. And you think about the 70s, and particularly late 70s, early 80s, when I was thinking about college career, I decided I wanted to be a petroleum engineer. So I went to Colorado School of Mines, stayed in state, and got a petroleum engineering degree, and actually worked out in California and with a summer job, and actually at Prudhoe Bay, Alaska, one summer, and the summer of '86, and that's also the year I graduated. And people who've been in the industry a long time know that is the year that oil dropped to $8 a barrel from $40 a barrel. So all of there were no interviews on campus, a lot of layoffs across the industry, really tough time. But long story short, I ended up after about 8 months and finally some interviews within the industry, ended up getting an offer from Williams Pipeline, the liquid pipeline side of Williams at that time, which is now actually part of ONEOK. But I was offered an engineering position with a pipeline company. So my first job was, as far as from petroleum engineer as you can be, it was off to school to learn how to do PLC programming, relay ladder logic software, and then deploying really electrical engineering, writing software, and then actually deploying brand new PLCs and replacing old electromechanical relays and phone lines with satellite communications. So SCADA, system development, and stayed in the midstream side, never did go back to the upstream side of the business.
So what kept you in midstream?
I think once you change careers, are you going to something else? And I was fortunate because I was able to do engineering and then out in the district engineer and measurement engineer and then into hydraulics and system-wide type things where I got to see the big picture, running hydraulics for a 10-state system, and then got into business development, and then eventually was running the land and right-of-way group and off to some other things. There was always something interesting in the rotation to do, and I really did like both from the refined products, liquids, crude oil, and gas, which I had a little bit of taste of all of that. I really got a chance to enjoy what midstream had to offer. Eventually, I ended up building a nationwide telecom network and then went into construction for a while before I got back into oil and gas and midstream, but that's a much longer story.
Yeah. Well, the next question I was going to ask is, in your career, what are you most proud of building? And that could be a project or it could be organizationally as well.
Yeah, within the midstream business, I would say the thing I'm probably proudest of is having been part of the shale revolution. I was with, when I got back into the oil and gas or midstream industry, it was with Chesapeake Midstream, which then became Access Midstream and is now part of Williams. But I was fortunate enough to be able to work in the Barnett Shale when it was the hottest drilling area, primarily dry gas, not processable gas, and then moved to the Marcellus Utica, Chesapeake, when they were drilling, one of the early pioneers drilling production out there, and then moved to MarkWest and stayed in the Marcellus Utica. But I think being able to connect hundreds of wells in a short period of time, 2 or 3 years across multiple regions, and building the team to do that, and then at MarkWest building as many as 10 new processing plants per year for about a 3 or 4 year period. We were a small company that had only was less than 10 years old as far as a public company. And we had a $2 billion a year capital budget, which executing on that many plants and that type of a budget and building pipelines in Appalachian mountain areas and building a team while you're doing it's probably one of the things I'm proudest of is what we did in MarkWest and then continued on with MPLX in Appalachia.
So obviously you've risen through the ranks. You have a chief as the start of your title. And along the way, I'd imagine you've picked up a few ideas and heard some ideas on leadership. And so I'm just curious, like, what's a lesson that you learned, a leadership lesson that you learned the hard way?
There's probably more of those than I can count, but the ones that really stick out, or the one that really sticks out, is is really is the difference between leading and managing, or leading, being a servant leader versus being a boss, if you will, telling or directing people what to do versus showing and then leading the way and not asking anyone or expecting them to do what you're not willing or able or to do. So leading by example, empowering people, motivating and showing, and then watching them develop versus maybe pushing. And I think as you gain experience, and I've been out of school in the work field for actually 40 years, and a lot of different industries. And I think the one thing that carries over across, transcends industries and companies, is that servant leadership and treating everyone. I've always tried to treat. I grew up, in, like I said, on a farm and a blue collar environment, and I've always tried to see the value of what everyone does, no matter what level they are in a company. Everyone has an important part to bring, and they're a part of the team that if they didn't do what they did, the team wouldn't be successful. So really trying to understand also, um, uh, the value that everyone in the organization brings, and maybe not one or two uh, people that are, very important and maybe have important jobs and regret, but a little bit more experience. Everyone has their part to play. Trying to give people the tools they need, and taking that servant leadership attitude of how can I help you? What can I do to help you? And then let them do it, empower them to do it.
Shift gears and talk a little bit about the industry, and technology is reshaping how operations are working. Automation, AI, advanced analytics. Where do you see the biggest operational changes happening in midstream, and where do you think they're going to come?
Well, I go back to almost 40 years ago, and I look at taking these large rooms full of electromechanical relays and lots of wiring and a lot of analog type equipment and primitive dial-up type communications. That kind of evolved in the 60s and into some microwave towers and and then into satellite. But fiber optic connectivity, starting out interstate, but then wireless on top of that with the backbone. Internet protocol, IP devices, the ability to put smart devices out in any place in the field. And not only to operate and more efficiently, but to be able to gather data that there's more data there than we would have been able to use or compute. What AI does, and we're using that. For example, we have a program we call ECHO, which is it's an acronym, but it really stands for the health monitoring of engines and compression units out in the field. The vendors provide a lot of data points and a lot of the ability to acquire a lot of this data in digital format. The difficulty was, what do you do with it? And so you have to have an engine that can take all of that and track and look for trends in terms of whether it be bearing wear, temperature, whatever. We found that we can actually, it's an early indicator, an early warning system, if you will, where we can fix something before it breaks when it starts to wear. Or in some cases, if things are running well and there's no sign of wear, we can extend the 6-month, let's say, overhaul or turnaround to 12 months, which is more efficient. And it helps with our runtime and with our unit costs. There's an example of taking data that's available and putting a front end up, very smart AI type engine on the front to be able to do something with it. The other things are, I think, where some of the things the technology provides that we maybe have some concern about, and whether it's IT or OT, is cybersecurity, and the fact that there is a lot of the ability to receive a lot of data, and also to the control systems are automated and tied together. So having really, really solid protections, firewalls, multifaceted type entry points to make sure that just the people who are authorized, have the ability to get in and make changes or do those kind of things. And we spend a lot of time on that. We've got a really good cyber group within our IT and OT department. And part of that is equipment upgrades, and it's not something you do overnight. It's something that we've been working on for a number of years. I know a lot of my colleagues in the industry have been also. So I think there's opportunities, and then with that comes, with more data comes the even more requirement to make sure we protect the data and the equipment, the smart equipment that we're getting the data from.
Electrify everything versus building hydrocarbon infrastructure.
I talked a little bit about kind of the data center piece, and then one of my feeling is that its data center is one more demand point, just like LNG or any other um, whatever the mechanism is to create more demand for natural gas and NGLs, we see data centers as along with LNG as two big drivers that will help because we're making more gas, more NGLs than we ever have. And we need to find demand for those to keep the industry vibrant and keep the prices a level where we continue to drill and increase production. So the power grids are strained even before data centers. You can read articles or go to conferences where representatives from the various grids around the country talk about where they're at in terms of utilization and peak load in the summer and in the winter and what they're doing to augment or what they're trying to do to augment. And I think everyone feels that the fastest way to do that is from a permitting and if you're a public utility from a regulatory standpoint is for behind the meter, so-called behind the meter generation. Behind the meter would be instead of pulling power off the grid or relying on a big combined cycle, coal or gas plant or solar or wind, it would be some of smaller, let's say a turbine or a Caterpillar engine driving a generator would provide their power not only for their own facility, but then shed power into the grid to actually help become a generator of either peak or surplus energy. And we're seeing more and more of that. A lot of the, particularly midstreamers that talk about it in some cases, building pipelines to supply gas to a new data center or maybe to a new power plant, or in some cases going even a little bit further down the chain and building their own, looking at investing in their own data centers. We would probably be more to the side of the spectrum, at least right now, in terms of working with other companies to provide gas and facilities and then receive back lower cost and higher reliability electric power. So it's a demand side for our customers. It's a reliability and electric cost to run the facilities. So there's a lot of good synergies there, and I think you'll see more and more people in midstream um, involved in those kind of actions, if not generating their own a portion of their own power. We're going to need power beyond what we probably can even imagine right now, and we're going to need every source of fuel that it takes to, or types of ways to generate electric power. I'm a firm believer that it's all of the above. It's solar, it's wind, it's hydro, it's nuclear, it's as well as fossil fuels, and that includes coal, gas, and potentially even oil. There's a lot of fuel oil burned in the Northeast during the Winter Storm Fern out of necessity to keep pipes from freezing and to uh, keep facilities running and the heat on. We need to figure out how to do it as clean as possible. So as an industry and individual companies, I know a lot of us are continue to take steps regardless of the cycles in regulations or political cycles, basically. In spite of those, we're continuing to move forward with reducing greenhouse gases from our emissions from our facilities. We started that plan. We had a 10 or 15-year goal, and we're continuing to work to reduce every year. Just keep molecules in the pipe, figure out a way not to vent gas or to, if we know there's areas that are sort of known sources of methane venting, converting over to electric or air, case of pneumatic pumps, trying to reroute instead of venting pig launch receivers, the gas from high pressure into low pressure side of the pipe without either flaring or venting it. So there's a lot of things a lot of us are working on, and we'll continue to work on that regardless of any shift in regulations.
One question that always comes up when I start thinking about the energy mix and electrify everything is supply chains and the wait for equipment and the shortage of workers. And I mean, you think about just to the amount of transmission that's necessary to meet demand and the reality that we don't really have the steel that we need to make the transformers to, and then we don't have enough linemen to hang the lines and all that. And so, and then on the production side of it, the generation side of it, there are issues with procuring turbines. And then there's also issues with renewable supply chains. And so I guess your thoughts, if you have any grand thoughts on what's going on on the supply chain side of things and how you see that getting worked out.
Yeah, there's no doubt that it is having an impact on supply chains. The order queues are longer, the wait times are longer. Um, and in many cases, the developers that are developing data centers, or at least the power and the generation to to make the electricity for the data center are getting in some of the same queues, whether it be gas turbine manufacturers as prime movers or reciprocal engines. The generators, as you said, I mean, lots and lots of copper and other metals for windings and for electric motors, and then also cables. And that competes with midstream when we're trying to build out more gathering lines and more compression to move more gas to feed the facilities. So I think people are, there's going to have to be there's going to have to be expansion on the supply chain side. And in order to do that, I think those suppliers and vendors need to see that there is either orders in hand or a long-term commitment, because I think there's been cases before where there's been a mini boom, let's say for the gas turbine demand, and then it was a quick boom and then it went away. And then you have investment, staffing, just overall costs and investment that aren't going to get a payout. So people are a lot more, just as you've seen the oil and gas industry become more conservative in terms of sort of wait and see and moderated activity when prices spike or go the other way. I think the suppliers want to know that it's real, and I think they're seeing that. But you're going to have to pay a reservation fee typically to get a spot in the queue. But if you have a legitimate project that's funded and you have cash in hand and can come by, we're still finding that we have access to the equipment we need without big delays on our projects. But part of that has been prior planning and making sure that we've got some units ordered. You have to have some inventory. You can't completely rely on direct value chain that someone else is going to have a warehouse full of equipment, because most of it's spoken for.
How much does permitting reform or the permitting system, what role does that play in terms of the committed project? Like the project is definitely going to go forward kind of certainty that you were referencing that the suppliers will need.
Yeah, there's certain areas that are very where you see some of the most activity. Let's talk about New Mexico, West Texas, Delaware, Permian Basin, or even the Haynesville. Out in the Permian Delaware, there's a lot of federal land, BLM land, state land, and then some large private owners. In terms of land acquisition, right of way acquisition, permitting, things tend to be more consistent, fairly streamlined. If you move further, let's say into Appalachia or the Northeast, every state's a little bit different, but there can be quite a bit of variation in terms of not only the timeline for the permit review times, but also expectations around flare equipment or combustion equipment, or just generally the emissions involved in an air permit. And you tend to have more mountains and you've got more water and there's more trees. So if you have, let's say, Indiana bat habitat with certain windows where you can't clear trees for 6 months, or or it's a stream where you have to decide whether, you need to install a pipe with a directional drill, and if it's a long drill, it can be fairly detailed in permitting. So I think the permitting is always been kind of the critical path, the long lead time item, because a lot of times you can't start construction before that. As you have longer lead time on some of the materials, sometimes that's now become the long lead time critical path. But in some cases, you can at least run them in parallel and not have quite as major of an impact on the overall timeline. Let's say to build a new plant or a pipeline system is used as you otherwise would have if they were all sequential.
Let's shift gears now and talk a little bit about GPA Midstream. So sort of the same question that we got started with, but how did you get involved with GPA Midstream?
You could say I started back in engineering school as a petroleum engineer, and whether it be mostly you have drilling and reservoir engineering classes, and also production, which gets into completions, but also wellhead equipment and both natural gas and crude oil. And we all had one of the first things we got besides an early HP calculator was the GPSA data books, and we learned how to use those for classwork tests. Really, really great resource. It always has been. And so that was, a lot of those people admire. That's always sort of been probably the primary connection. And then maybe getting involved in local chapters, which early on in midstream we did. But I was in liquid pipeline for a while, maybe not quite as involved on what had been more of a gas and gas processing and NGL driven group. But I definitely got more involved after I came back into the industry, and particularly in the shale boom and the gas side. It's been 15 years, 16 years ago now. And then really picked up my involvement kind of MarkWest, or sort of post MarkWest MPLX merger, which has already been 10 years ago. It's hard to believe. So I was asked, our prior COO at MarkWest, John Mollenkopf, was was very active and had been our board member, and then was actually the chairman in the role I'm in at one point before he retired from the company. And then another person in my group, Greg Bezdek, took over, and then I came in behind Greg as a board member. So I've gotten really last 5 years much more involved, but always, at least in the periphery, involved with GPA. I think it's, I have always thought it's a great organization. And I think those of us with an engineering background or are involved in building facilities or operating, we go to the annual convention and the conference, and you do a lot of networking through that. It's been one of the best ways to meet whether it's supplier vendors or other midstreamers, to meet peers. The advocacy piece has really picked up over the last 7 or 8 years, and that's become a huge part of what we do. And it's one of the reasons I'm in this chair role and why I've been on the board is I really am passionate about the natural gas and NGL industry in particular. And I'm passionate about overall energy industry and the fossil fuels. And API does great things. INGA does great things. But there's only one organization that as a party watches out for the gathering, compression, gas processing, NGL side of the business. And that is GPA Midstream. And we need to have a voice, and we need to not just sort of from an advocacy standpoint, become sort of on the bus, but on someone else's bus and agenda, because we aren't necessarily going to get the priority that we need standalone within an organization that represents liquid pipelines, terminals, upstream, midstream, and downstream refining like an API does. We're much more specialized. We have specialized needs. Our business is different. We're not a regulated business. We don't have, most of us are fee-based. Any extra costs that we add, whether it be through regulation or otherwise, comes off the bottom line. We can't increase our fees to make up for that difference. And that's different from, say, an interstate gas pipeline or even some of the interstate liquid pipelines that are tariff-based. And we don't have necessarily the ability, like the downstream or upstream folks, that when things are really, really good, you have a windfall and then you have lean years, but you have the ability to make up and get a quick return, in some cases, even when costs go up. We have to have very steady to declining costs, but definitely not increasing costs where we have fixed fees. And we need to grow and also make a positive cash flow where we can continue to invest in new facilities and grow. So GPA ensures that we have a voice, and that it's a voice specific to our specific needs and requirements, and making sure that from a legislative regulatory standpoint, that something isn't passed or advocated for by the industry that actually maybe wasn't a priority that we wanted to see or good for specifically to midstream. So that's what I'm passionate about, having that voice about this business and having the voice that GPA provides.
So a topic that you mentioned in your speech at Center Stage Luncheon during convention last year was about mergers and acquisitions and how they're affecting GPA Midstream. More specifically, the midstream pie has gotten larger, but we're also slicing it into much larger slices than it used to be. Go back 10 years, GPA Midstream had more than 100 members. We're now down to around 50. And it's not because the industry is getting any smaller. It's simply because there are fewer companies as they merge and acquire. And so there are still a few midstream companies that are not members of GPA Midstream. And so I'm curious what you would say to your peers at those companies about why they should take the plunge and become part of GPA Midstream.
I think it really kind of comes back to what the message that I was delivering about what GPA does that's unique and why we need to have our own voice. If we don't look out for specifically for the midstream gathering processing components that we're focused on, no one else is going to have that as a priority because they have too many other priorities. So having a voice and being part of that is important, that GPA is an organization that provides it. There is a higher expectation and responsibility on all of us who are members when you drop from over 100 to 50 or a little bit less. As you said, Kevin, not because people are leaving per se, but because one company bought two others or one other, and the new companies coming online or not, that growth isn't high enough to cover the merger side. Those of us who have gotten larger and acquiring other companies and maybe, now represent what used to be two or three, we have the responsibility to make sure that even more so that our people, including the prior company people, that everyone is serving on committees, everyone is participating and making sure that we don't lose the good input and the talent that we had. Just overall, we need involvement. We need people signed up on committees, but we need people working. and contributing on the committee. This is a chance for all of us. I would tell my peers this, and I do during executive committee meetings and board meetings. If we don't do it, no one's going to do it. And if it's important to do, we all need to roll up our sleeves and do it and make sure that our people are active and involved. And because the advocacy is that we do, or what we look at in terms of research and where our dollars go, needs to be. I mean, we'll have the best outcome if we have the most input from the most different perspectives within the group we have. I don't think there's a better bargain out there. We're in a lot of at Marathon and MPLX, we're in a lot of different organizations, and so I'm pretty well aware, and a lot of my peers are in other companies, relatively what our dues are, even for the highest level versus most other organizations. And we're, if not the lowest, one of the lowest out there in terms of dues. So it really is a bargain and a value. It's a high value for all of our members. I think you recognize that, but we all need to go out and continue to identify and recruit new members and be able to tell them all of the benefits that I've just talked about in terms of value and having a voice. The smaller the group, the smaller the number of people. Conversely, new members that join or join an organization where they can have almost like a disproportionate input in terms of, it's one thing to be a new player with 100, it's with 45 or 50, it's a different makeup and a chance to have a voice. So we're always looking for new members. We welcome new members and think we have a great story to tell and something to sell in terms of value.
So if GPA didn't exist, what would the industry miss first, or what would they miss most?
I think we would miss the collaboration and the sharing of best practices and ideas. When I say collaboration, I'm just talking about things like safety and what can we do better to make the industry more efficient and to provide a better product and a safer work environment. And there's also a good chance to really understand, like through the annual convention and the interaction with GPSA, a chance to meet with more vendors and suppliers and understand the products they sell and see what's new. That collaboration and understanding on a more accelerated basis, what's out there that we should be looking at and could actually help us provide safe, reliable operations in all of our systems. I think the oil and gas industry, the fossil fuels industry, would miss the specific expertise of natural gas and particularly from the wellhead in, because a lot of the API, for example, you've got that blend of crude oil and liquids, crude oil and refined products pipeline all the way down through refining. And so it touches on gas, but in terms of real focus, gas is different. You pump crude oil, you pump refined products. They're liquids, we're gas. We have liquids as well, but sometimes the liquids are vapor. So it's a whole different, from a technical standpoint, engineering, operations, operational risk standpoint. But we have cryogenic facilities to take LPGs or NGLs that otherwise want to be a gas and compress them and cool them to where they turn into liquids. That expertise that comes and then the sharing of technical expertise is something that you can't produce crude oil without gas. Even if you want to go in and drill crude, you're going to have the gas, you have to deal with it. And we think it's going to continue to provide a really good economic and uplift and a high volume as we look into the future. Got lots and lots of natural gas. Really bullish at my company and most of our peers about the future of natural gas. Having that expertise that knows how to handle it from the wellhead through the separation process is not something you're going to have that amount of volume or that level of expertise if we weren't here. I'm convinced of that.
You did mention committees before, and so I just wanted to sort of wrap back to that. The committee system is vital for setting standards, for dealing with all kinds of technical advocacy, safety, communications, all of these different kinds of issues. We have noted that MPLX and Marathon have a number of employees who volunteer on the committees, who lead the committees. Why is that service important to your company?
I'm really a strong believer that we all have to carry our share of the responsibility and the weight. And the committees are not, a committee isn't a committee if there's a leader that's doing all the work or maybe a leader and a co-leader. And so I always tell our people, first join the committees, but then you need to be, we'll give you the time. Everybody's busy, but this is important too. And we expect that you will not only attend meetings or attend phone calls, but that you're going to be taking on a lot of the work. And a lot of them are longtime Marathon employees that came from the refinery side that are maybe a little bit newer to to our natural gas and NGL side, but they're passionate about. They see an opportunity to kind of take another step forward in certain areas, whether it be process safety, and adding that to the mix, or some of the the personal safety, environmental. There's things that from a best practices standpoint, and that would overall help the industry in terms of what we do. They're passionate about that. So it is not by accident. It's on purpose. I talk to our committee members, and in my direct reports, and the committee members report to, a lot of them are involved too, and from an engineering side, environmental health and safety, advocacy, we feel really strongly about always sort of raising the bar and doing a little bit better. And to the extent we can help bring some input, bring that along. I think people get excited about it if they actually see others are participating and joining. But you have to ultimately, something has to come out of it, right? If we just have meetings and talk about things, and there aren't recommendations that are enacted and we're actually moving forward, then it doesn't matter whether it's my company or one of our other midstream peer companies. You'll lose energy and momentum if people don't feel like what they're doing is, because it takes a lot of time. All these people are really, really busy with their day jobs and building new projects and operating complex systems and facilities. So we want to make sure that their time is well spent, and that the best way to make sure that happens is to be actively involved and not passive, and continue to be the voice to drive that, to try to make it happen. I always tell our folks, I'll go in, and you have good ideas, or if there's things that you want me to bring up, I'll help advocate for that if I think it's something that would be a good idea to at least bring it up with the board, the executive committee. So I think our executive committee members, our board members, but anyone who's kind of the lead member on any of the companies that are members, I personally think that it's up to us to take the lead, to find out, first of all, who are our employees that are members, who are serving on committees or signed up to serve. Are they serving? And then to meet with them fairly regularly to find out what they're doing, and are they actively serving. And if we all did that on a regular basis, I think we wouldn't have there wouldn't, not that there are issues, but there certainly would help guarantee there's no issues in terms of spreading the workload and making sure everyone's voice is heard.
The final question: when people look back at this era of midstream, say 20 years from now, what do you hope they say the industry got right?
What I hope they say is, particularly on the natural gas side, we're living in a country that was out of natural gas in the 90s. In fact, using gas as a source of fuel for power plants that would take away gas from residential heating and use was banned. And that's when a lot of, for example, coal-fired plants were built out through the 80s, 90s. Once the shale revolution happened, and some pioneers really drove the technological advancements in terms of combining long horizontally drilled laterals with hydraulic fracturing. And then also companies like MarkWest and others went out, took a risk, and raised a lot of money and started connecting those wells, building compression, and eventually processing. We went from a country that was out of gas to one that every day now produces roughly, I think it's up to 110 BCF a day. I'm proud, particularly with my company, that about 10% of all that 110, most of it gets about 10 BCF a day processed, and another 2 BCF a day that's dry or lean gas. It's not. So we're a little over 10% of all those molecules move somewhere through our system. And some of collectively our peers can say something similar, but that 10 billion of processing, over 90% of it didn't exist 15 years ago. We didn't export any propane 7 or 8 years ago, maybe 9 years ago. We made it and stored it in the summer and year round, and then depleted the inventories and all the storage in the winter, and then you start the cycle again. That was when we were making probably 700,000 or 800,000 barrels a day of propane. Now we make 2.9 million barrels a day of propane, and the demand is roughly the same. So you do the math. We have to export 2 million barrels a day of propane every day, and we didn't export any, within the last, if you go back a decade. So the scale in which all the pipelines that have had to be built, transmission lines, gathering lines, all the compression, all the pump stations to the NGLs, all of those processing plants and fractionators, nothing has been done like that over history. And we've done it by every year bringing the greenhouse gas emissions, made it cleaner every year. We make energy cleaner than anyone in the world, and we've continued to raise the bar in terms of how much, even while the volume's going up, we're actually coming down on the emission side. So what we got right was turning around a net importer, non-self-reliant, to a self-reliant largest exporter of pretty much everything now from fossil fuel standpoint with energy security and doing it cleaner than anyone else. And having done all of the majority of the facilities required to do that in less than 20 years. Lots to be proud of.
Yeah, yeah, I was going to say. So, all right. Thank you very much for being the first guest of the Midstream News Podcast. And we will end it there.